In 1.8 we added some features to the layers. So for example, now you are able to add media layers, compositing layers, so for example to load Notch, Unreal and Unity scenes, and also data layers, for example to add a pdtf file and to animate the perspectives. So for example, if you want to load an Unreal scene, then you just have to create such a layer, which is a compositing layer. Then you have to add a scene to the resources of Pixera, so for example this one. And now you can use this scene just by drag and drop it to the timeline. In Pixera 1.8 we added a new possibility to animate the perspectives of a screen. To do so we have to create a special layer. This layer is called data layer. It can be found if you right click here in the layer head, add layer, data layer, perspective 2D. As soon as we have created such a new layer, we are able to add a new empty object. This can be done by double-clicking into this layer. Now we are able to move or to animate the perspective of the screens. To do so, we have to dive into the compositing view, to the inner compositing. And in here we can now see the perspectives if we change our selection mode from layers to perspectives. As you now can see, here's the perspective of the screen displayed. The resolution of this perspective is 1920 by 1080 and it's located at 00. So let's now select this perspective and start to move it around. If you want to get more details about these different settings, then please have a look on our tutorial screen settings, which you can find on YouTube. So for now we just change from origin to absolute, which means we detach the perspective from the screen, and now we are able to move it around. And as you can see, down here we already get the dominant value for this perspective. If we expand our layer, we already see the position. The workflow to save these keyframes is exactly the same like for content. So we just press S to store these keyframes on the timeline. Then we move the perspective somewhere else, store the keyframes again, and now we also can play back the timeline to see how the animation looks like. Of course, you also can edit the parameters of this perspective in the inspector. So just select the perspective, and on the right hand side in the inspector you can find the settings. So you can find, for example, the position. You also can change the size. And down here you also can find the buttons to snap it to the screen or to reset it completely to its original position. We also made some improvements to the Soft Edge tab. So let's select the projector and move over to Soft Edge. If we scroll down a little bit, then we can find a new function which is called Blacklevel correction. If we activate it, we now have access to these functions. So we can offset the color, for example. So now it's all RGB is locked together. We can separate the colors to do a color correction just only on red, green or blue. And we also can change the threshold and the softness of our Blacklevel correction. Another button is to toggle the visibility of all soft edges, which deactivates or disable all soft edges at once. Besides these adaptations in the Soft Edge tab, we also have a very nice new function in the Warping tab. And this new function is called Blackout Projector Output, which means if you select this option, you will get a black image on the output of this single projector. You have access to this function right here in the inspector, or if you have more than one projectors, you also can choose the project tab, right click on the projector, and in here you can find this blackout function as well. So if I activate it, it gets highlighted yellow. In Pixera 1.8 we also added the possibility to play out sACN as output. So if you go to your mapping tab live, you can add a new ArtNet stream, and if you select this ArtNet stream, now you can select if it should be played out via ArtNet or via sACN. So for example, you also can rename it like shown in the video. You can change which network adapter you want to use, and you can select between ArtNet and sACN, as well as the IP addresses and the port. And last but not least, you also can decide to which display this stream should be assigned. In Pixera 1.8 you now have the possibility to, in example, color correct the output. So if you select the projector, you get all the possibilities of the color correction in the inspector on the right side. So if you scroll down a bit, you can find the settings color correction, and if you unfold it, here you can find all the parameters. So in example, you can change for example, white point, the temperature, you can change how the shadows look like and so on, like midtones, light, hue saturation values as well. So here you get the circles, which you can change. You also have the possibility to reset everything you have done, so all at once or just parameter wise, and you also can disable it and enable it to check how it looks with your change or without your change. You can use the color correction not only on projectors, you also can use the color correction on displays and LED walls. So for example, if we have a look on it, in the inspector, if you select it, you can find the color correction options here as well. Beside the parameter-based color correction, you now also have the possibility to load lookup tables. Just select your projector, for example, change over to the inspector on the right side, open up color correction, and in here you can find lookup table. Just load, for example, a lookup table with the ending .cube, and now you can instantly see how this lookup table take effect of your output. So if you want to mute it, for example, just hit the I, or with the button reset you also can unload this lookup table. Those lookup tables are also available for not only projectors, you also can load them in displays and LED walls. The feature of color correction also has been added to the compositing tab, which means now you are able to color correct, for example, the clips on the timeline. Just select the clip on the timeline, and in the inspector you can find all the parameters you already know from the color correction in the mapping tab. So for example, if you change something here in the inspector, you will automatically create dominant values. These dominant values can be stored as keyframes on the timeline. So you also can animate the color correction. So besides the sliders, you also have the possibility to use the color correction HSV with its color wheels. And as you can see, even those parameters are added to the timeline. An important hint for using the color correction in the compositing tab on the timeline. So for example, if you have your video in free run loop and you want to change some settings of your colors, then you have to keep in mind that the loop will start from the beginning again. The reason for that is because the color correction is handled like an effect. So every time you use it the first time for this clip or for this layer, these parameters have to be added to the layer. But don't worry, this just happens the first time you change anything on this layer. Whenever you already have changed something, then the parameters are already available and it doesn't affect the loop. In 1.8 we added a visualization for the output assignment, which is called output routing. To visualize this, I added just a few displays and projectors. So till now the workflow was to select, for example, an image device or the output and to assign this device to the output, or you just select the projector, switch over to the inspector, and in there you're also able to choose the connected output. So now we added a new tab up here in the workspace, which is called output routing, and if you open it up you can see a node-based output routing system. So on the right side you can find your available displays, screens and projectors, and on the left side you can find your live system. So in that case my first output is connected to the display. So if you just grab that line and move it somewhere else, you can delete it, and if you reconnect it to another display you can see that the new mapping is created. You also can detach, for example, the projector from your output by pressing Alt on your keyboard, and if you want to reconnect it you just grab the point and drag it over to the projector. In Pixera 1.8 we made several brushes and adaptations to our warping tab. For example, till now you were only able to use the interpolation between the points Bezier. Now you also have the chance to switch this Bezier curve to linear, which means if you activate linear that you will get straight lines and hard edges between the manipulation points or the control points. So if you change back to Bezier you can see the difference. Once a hard edge or a nice Bezier curve. Another new feature in version 1. Is the possibility to change the feed area mesh segments. By default all projectors are set to feed area none original object, which means each projector covers just a very small part of the projection surface. So if you want to warp this projector you just have those dots or those control points available for warping. So if you have very less control points available in your warping, it can cause a bad result on your output. So for example, you don't get a curved line, you get just a lot of edges and steps and so on. So now we have the possibility to improve that. Therefore we have to select all projectors and choose feed area, for example fit. Now we are able to change the feed area mesh segments. So what does it mean? For example, if we now change on a warp mesh to vertices, then we see all the control points. In that case, it's 32 by 18. If we now bring them down to 4 by 4, we can see that we just have a few control points available. If we now make a change in the warp mesh, we get the same result like before. We have not straight lines, we have not nice curves. So now let's increase the numbers of mesh segments again. And if we now make a change in our warp mesh, you can see on the output that the curves are already much nicer, much smoother. We also tried to improve the workflow of warping by adding the possibility to display the control points on the output. If you want to display the selected points on the output, just select the projector and enable display control points on output. In the compositing tab, we did several changes as well. One of these changes is, for example, to be able to rearrange your windows in Pixera. So all over the software you can find those small symbols, which allows you to change the window layout. You also can find the symbol on the timeline, and furthermore in here you also can find the option to detach the timeline. This gives you the possibility to pop out the timeline and, for example, move it over to a second monitor. On the top left corner you can find as well a timeline selection if you want to switch between existing timelines. A huge brush has happened to the clip inspector. To visualize it a bit better, I created a small timeline with some clips in it and also a small animation on clip number 1. So till now, if you wanted to change some keyframe parameters of a clip, you had to expand quite a few things on the timeline, which made a huge timeline quite confusing. So now we changed that quite a lot. So if you select a clip on the timeline, in the inspector on the right side, you can see those keyframes now. So for example, you have the parameters for position, size and rotation available. So now you can easily change the keyframes by manipulating them in the inspector, which gives you a much better overview. You also can create new keyframes by just double-clicking on the line, like you know it from the parameters on the layer. Those parameters in the inspector are now available for all clips on the timeline. Furthermore, we changed the layout a little bit, so up here you can now find the time, the duration and the play mode. And as you can see down here in the inspector, we also added some important parameters directly to the inspector, which allows you to make changes much faster and easier than before. Another brush has happened to the option crossfade between two positions, either via shift click or right click fade to time. In fade to time you now have the possibility to change the time before jumping to this new position. As you can see on the output, till now we always crossfaded between those two positions. Now you have the possibility to change this crossfade to a dip to black, which means you don't crossfade between those two positions, you fade down to black and fade in from black to the full image again. Another new feature is to duplicate the timeline. Just move over to the library of the timelines, right click on the timeline you want to duplicate and select Duplicate Timeline. As you can see, it immediately pops up underneath in the list and it copies everything you already have on your timeline number 1. It behaves exactly the same way like you know it from duplicate layers. We also added a new functionality to the timeline master fader. So as you already know, by clicking on the eye up here, you get access to the timeline master fader. Next to the eye, you can find new buttons. Those buttons are meant to automatically fade in and fade out the timeline. You also can adjust the fade time by selecting the timeline and change the time here in the inspector. Here you also can find the buttons to fade in and fade out the timeline. In 1.8 we also added a new play mode. You can find the play mode by selecting the clip on the timeline. The new play mode is called lock to time no loop. So what is the difference between lock to time and lock to time no loop? So for example, if you expand your clip on the timeline longer than its original duration, then it doesn't loop anymore, as you might know it from lock to time. It just plays the video once and keep the last frame till the end of the object duration on the timeline. If you then move the now pointer to the section of the original clip duration, then the video starts to play again from this frame. In 1.8 we also added a new possibility to control the audio level of a layer. So either you select the layer and control it via the inspector here on the right side. So here you can find the parameters audibility and visibility. So in here you can mute and unmute the layer's visibility and volume, or you directly change the value for the opacity or the volume. You also can modify these parameters directly on the layer, so just expand the layer and down here you can find the new parameter for the volume. Now you are also able to animate the playback speed. To demonstrate this feature, I just created a clip on the timeline with some transport keyframes in it. So at first you have to select the clip and enable animate in the timing settings. The first two keyframes are with speed 2, the keyframes in the middle are with speed 0, and the last keyframe is with speed 2 again. And if you have now enabled the option animate, you can see now that the speed slows down till 0, here it pauses, and then it speeds up again to playback speed 2. We also made some changes to live preview editing. So as you might know, as soon as you activate this functionality, you get a second bluish now pointer. This blue now pointer only shows me the content in the preview, whilst my second now pointer, the gray one, is still showing the content on the output. You are now even able to add new content to the timeline. So let's drag and drop a new content on the timeline. Let's scale it a bit down. Store the keyframes for it. And then let's add a second clip behind it and add a small crossfade between them. And now we also can have a look how it looks in the preview. As you know, you also have the possibility to fade to the new position on the timeline or fade back to the original position on the timeline. You also can animate this with the button next to it. And now you even have the possibility to control the now pointer, which is responsible for the output, just by pressing and holding down the button Shift on the keyboard and clicking somewhere else in the timeline with the mouse. If you combine Shift and Spacebar, you can even play and pause the output now pointer. Additionally, you can even move around the preview now pointer just by starting the timeline, for example, and playback both, and my output now pointer still shows another part of the timeline. In the timeline tools, you can now find a new button, which is a record button. This new record mode can be activated either via the timeline tools or directly in the inspector by selecting the clip on the timeline. This allows you to directly store the keyframe whilst moving around the image in in-screen editing. So in example, if you activate this mode and you start to move around the picture in the in-screen editing, you can instantly see that new keyframes have been created on the timeline. So if you now move the now pointer to a different position and move again the picture, another new keyframe will be created. It also works whilst the timeline is running, so if you move around the picture during a running timeline, the values get recorded directly to the timeline. Now let's deactivate the recording mode and play back the timeline to have a look how the animation looks like. In the Resources tab of the timeline, we added some additional symbols. This symbol shows you if the content is available, not available, for example, because the content lost its path, or if it's currently transferring to a client. In this example, I just changed the path of some files, so that's why we get the X displayed next to the thumbnail. Don't be confused. In the preview you still see this content because Pixera always transcode a preview file out of the original file, which is by default located on the C drive of your master. Furthermore, we also added a new functionality to search and replace the files in the Resources tab. So just right click on, for example, a single file. A new window pops up, and in here you can find the different options to choose from. So for example, you can replace the resource, so search and replace it in a path. You can search it in a directory or on a volume. And to the very bottom you can find the result window. You can use this function either for single files or for a folder. In this example, I want to search and replace all the missing files of this folder directly in a directory. So if I now click on Start, after some seconds I can see the results in the small window. And if I press OK, the new files will be automatically added or replaced in the Resources tab. In 1.8 we enhanced the feature of using web browser resources on the timeline in terms of performance and handling. So if you now create a new web browser resource, it will automatically pop up in your resources, and if you select it in there, you can change the address on the right hand side in the inspector. If you have done this step, you can easily drag and drop this web browser resource onto your layer, which will then be displayed on your output. As you can see, most of the web pages automatically displays a cookie window, which prevents you from displaying the web page directly. in Pixera you now have the possibility to display the mouse cursor directly on your render output to, for example, accept such a window. Just move over to the Mapping tab, select in the Live tab your live system, and on the right hand side you can find in the inspector of your live system the Edit Debugging Engine settings. If you open up this setting, you can find a setting which is called Hide Mouse Cursor, which is by default enabled. If you now disable this function, you have to restart your render engine at first with Shift Escape and afterwards F5. Then you are able to move over your mouse onto the output, accept this window, and in example start a video on YouTube. Beside the new color correction options in the inspector of a clip, you are now also able to load a loot file for resources. So just select the resource in the library, switch over to the inspector on the right, select it in your Explorer, and it will automatically be applied to your resources. You also can distribute it to the clients, or you just clear it in here to have the original picture again. In 1.8 we also made some improvements on the layer sampler. The layer samplers are used, for example, for Unreal projects to share textures between the Unreal scene and Pixera, and it's also used for the mask RGB effect. So let's add the mask RGB effect to our layer, and as you can see, this mask effect creates a sampler directly on the layer. So now we can also add content to this sampler, so let's do that. I have a mask in my resources, for example. It doesn't matter if it's with white or with transparency. So I just drag and drop it onto the mask effect, set mix to 100%, and as you can see, it's automatically applied to my content. This sampler also follows the applied transport properties of the clip, and we even can use videos or live inputs in the sampler. So I now want to add my live webcam to the sampler, so I just select live input in my resources tab, select any of the cameras and drag and drop it onto the sampler. Furthermore, you also can add a second object or a second clip in the sampler. So double click behind the first clip, which automatically creates a new empty object, which then can be filled with a video or a mask or whatever. And of course, there are many more things to explore in Pixera 1.8. Like in example, our latest integration of Unreal and Pixera, which ensures an easy and fast workflow in XR setups, or the new control tab, which opens a whole new world of show control within Pixera.